The room went silent the moment he laughed. It was not the laughter of joy, but the sharp, cutting laugh of a man who believed he owned the space. The kind of sound that made your stomach clench before your mind even processed why. Mr. Hayes, the man in the crisp white shirt and a tie that screamed self-importance, stood at the front of the classroom, his voice dripping with condescension as he targeted the boy seated in the second row by the window. Tell me, Malik, do you even understand what these words mean? Or are you just pretending? His tone lingered on the word pretending, turning it into a weapon meant to slice through skin and pride. Malik, a 15-year-old with tightly coiled hair and a gaze far older than his years, felt the room's weight press down on him. He had grown used to whispers, to stares, to the invisible walls erected by those who thought his presence was an intrusion. But this was public execution disguised as education. His classmates froze, eyes darting between the teacher and the boy, each one calculating whether to laugh along, to stay silent, or to risk their own humiliation. Malik lifted his chin slightly, the golden light from the window spilling across his cheek as though the sun itself refused to let him disappear. He opened his mouth, but the words tangled against the knots swelling in his throat. Mr. Hayes smirked. I thought so. Maybe reading comprehension just isn't for everyone. A ripple of uneasy laughter rolled through the class. Some laughed out of fear, some out of habit, and some because cruelty can be contagious when led by authority. Malik's fists clenched beneath the desk. He wanted to scream, to throw the textbook back at the man who stood there wielding ignorance as superiority. Instead, he remembered his grandmother's voice, steady and unbreakable. Your silence can be a shield, but your words, when chosen, can be fire. He swallowed hard, forcing himself not to let the tears fall. The irony of the situation, though, was that Malik understood the text better than anyone else in the room. He had read it twice the night before, under the soft hum of a flickering lamp while his younger sister slept beside him. He had written notes in the margins, traced the author's pain and triumph as though they were his own. He didn't just understand it, lived it. But here he was, mocked in front of 30 pairs of eyes because of the color of his skin. The tension deepened when Mr. Hayes decided to push further. He walked slowly toward Malik's desk, the clicking of his shoes marking the rhythm of intimidation. You see, class, this is what happens when standards are lowered. When people are allowed into places they don't belong, everyone else suffers. His hand tapped the boy's textbook as if sealing his verdict. Silence hung heavy, suffocating, and yet Malik's pulse began to steady. Something inside him shifted. He realized that this wasn't just about him, it was about every student who had ever been told they didn't belong. The truth was brewing in that classroom, quietly, like a storm gathering at the horizon. It wasn't only Malik who felt the sting of injustice. Others had witnessed the small cuts of prejudice before comments about accents, the way names were mocked, the assumptions about intelligence and worth. But this was different. This was blatant. This was undeniable. The golden sunlight that streamed through the window did not ask permission to shine on Malik's face, and it seemed to dare the room to look away from the dignity burning in his eyes. When Malik finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. I understand every word, Mr. Hayes. The question is, do you? His words did not roar. They did not tremble. They simply existed, clean and sharp, like glass breaking in a quiet room. For a moment, no one moved. Mr. Hayes's smirk faltered, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to uncertainty. Then, as if to reclaim his dominance, he barked out, "Explain it then. Right here. Right now. Let's hear you impress us." And Malik did. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and he began to unravel the text with clarity and passion. He spoke of themes and metaphors, of history's echoes and the weight of human struggle. He spoke not as a boy desperate to prove himself, but as a mind unchained, refusing to be silenced. The words filled the classroom, weaving through the air until every student sat still, captivated. The laughter had died, replaced by something heavier, something real. As he spoke, Malik's classmates began to shift. A girl in the back straightened in her seat, her eyes wide with admiration. A boy who had chuckled nervously earlier now looked down at his desk, shame creeping up his neck. And Mr. Hayes's face reddened, his grip on authority loosening with every word Malik spoke. For the first time, he looked small. The arrogance that had carried him faltered, cracked open by the undeniable truth standing before him. By the time Malik sat down, the room was silent again, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of reckoning. Mr. Hayes opened his mouth, then closed it, his jaw tight as though fighting a war inside himself. He could not dismiss Malik's brilliance. He could not unhear the depth of understanding that had just been laid bare. His power, so carefully constructed, was unraveling in the golden light of a single afternoon. But pride is a stubborn thing. Rather than acknowledge what had just happened, he snapped, "Sit down. That will be enough." His voice wavered, betraying the cracks in his authority. Malik obeyed, but the damage had already been done not to Malik, but to the man who had sought to humiliate him. The story was no longer about a student who had been mocked. It was about a teacher whose mask of superiority had been torn away, exposing the fragility beneath. And as the class ended, as backpacks rustled and feet shuffled toward the door, whispers spread. The truth was alive now, carried in every student's eyes. What Mr. Hayes did not know was that the consequences of this moment would follow him far beyond the walls of that classroom. The storm was coming, and it would not be silent. The bell rang, but no one rushed out. The usual chaos of chatter, slamming lockers, and running footsteps was delayed, as though the students were reluctant to disturb the gravity of what had just happened. Malik packed his notebook slowly, deliberately, his hands steady despite the storm inside him. He knew eyes were on him, measuring, reevaluating, reconsidering who he was. He did not look up to meet them. Dignity sometimes meant not demanding recognition, but carrying yourself as though it were already yours. Mr. Hayes, on the other hand, avoided Malik's gaze entirely. He busied himself at his desk, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling, adjusting the chalk on the tray, anything to distract himself from the truth that had shattered the room's balance. His authority had cracked like thin glass, and the shards cut sharper because he knew deep down that it was his own hand that had struck the blow. As Malik walked toward the door, a voice called softly from behind. "Hey, that was amazing." It was Sarah, the quiet girl who often kept her head buried in books. She offered a small smile, one that trembled with sincerity. Malik nodded, unsure what to say. Compliments felt fragile in a place where mockery had just ruled. But her words planted something in him, a seed of recognition that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. Outside the classroom, the hallway buzzed with fragments of conversation. "Did you hear what he said? I've never seen Hayes like that. Malik just destroyed him." Rumors moved fast in schools, and by lunchtime, the story had already grown its own wings. Some students exaggerated, claiming Malik shouted, that Hayes nearly screamed. Others whispered that the teacher looked like he was about to cry. In the retelling, Malik was no longer just a boy in the second row, was a symbol, a spark. But symbols carry weight, and by the afternoon Malik felt its burden pressing hard. He sat in the cafeteria with his tray untouched, his sister Layla at his side. Layla, 2 years younger, had eyes like fire when it came to defending her brother. "They can't treat you like that," she hissed. "You should tell Mom. You should tell the principal." Malik hesitated. "It's not that simple. If I complain, they'll just say I'm making excuses. Or worse, they'll make life harder for me." He picked at the sandwich crust, the food tasting like cardboard in his mouth. Layla slammed her palm against the table, earning a few stares. "Then we make them listen," she said. "We don't let him get away with it." Her words echoed the voice inside him, the one he had been trying to suppress. Malik didn't want to become a spectacle, didn't want every step he took to be scrutinized under the lens of race and injustice. But maybe the spectacle had already been made and not by him. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, Mr. Hayes sat stiffly at the corner table, pretending to grade papers. His colleagues chatted around him, their voices low but not low enough. He caught snippets, heard something happened in his class. The African kid, Hayes lost control. The shame clawed at him, raw and unrelenting. He told himself they didn't understand, that he had only been trying to set high standards. But the memory of Malik's steady voice replayed in his mind, gnawing at the edges of his pride. "I understand every word. The question is still you?" That night, Malik's mother noticed his silence. She was a woman who carried herself with quiet strength, her hands calloused from long hours at the hospital, her heart heavy with both sacrifice and love. "What happened at school?" she asked, her tone more observation than question. Malik hesitated, then told her everything. He didn't dramatize, didn't embellish, simply laid out the truth as it had unfolded. Her eyes darkened. "They will not treat my son this way," she said, her voice firm with resolve. But Malik shook his head. "Please, Mom. Just. Not yet. Let me handle this my way." She studied him, seeing not just the boy she had raised but the man he was beginning to become. Slowly, she nodded, though the tension in her jaw betrayed her restraint. The next day, the atmosphere in the classroom was electric. Students entered with anticipation buzzing in the air, whispers darting like sparks. Malik felt at the moment he walked in every glance carried weight, every smile or frown a statement. He took his seat without acknowledging them, but his presence itself seemed louder than words. Mr. Hayes began the lesson as though nothing had happened. His voice was steady but lacked its usual sharpness. He avoided Malik's side of the room, focusing instead on the board, on the text, on anything that would keep him from confronting the reality that his control was slipping. But the students noticed. They always notice. And the more he tried to maintain normalcy, the more obvious his unease became. Then came the breaking point. During a discussion on civil rights literature, a student in the back, Jason, known for his reckless mouth, snorted. "Kind of ironic, isn't it? Talking about equality in this class." The room froze. Mr. Hayes's face went pale. "That's enough," he snapped, his voice sharper than intended. But Jason smirked. "Why? Afraid we'll talk about what really happened yesterday." The dam cracked. Students began murmuring, some nodding, some challenging. Voices rose. He was out of line. No, Malik showed him. Teachers shouldn't get away with that. The classroom turned into a battlefield of perspectives, the truth no longer confined to whispers, but spilling openly, chaotically. Malik sat still, his heart pounding. He hadn't wanted this, not like this. Yet here it was, unfolding in front of him, unstoppable. For the first time, the silence that had once suffocated him now belonged to someone else. Mr. Hayes stood frozen, his authority stripped by the very students he had once controlled. "Enough," he shouted finally, slamming his hand against the desk. The sound reverberated, but it did not silence them. Instead, the room quieted out of something else bitty. They saw him now not as the powerful figure at the front of the class, but as a man unraveling. In that moment, Malik understood something his grandmother had always tried to teach him. The oppressor is often a prisoner of his own lies. And when the truth begins to seep through, it is not the oppressed who crumble, but the one who built his house on sand. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Teachers whispered, students buzzed, and Malik found himself the reluctant center of a storm. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a boy who had spoken when silence was easier. Yet even that small act had grown beyond him, sparking something larger, something undeniable. At home that evening, Malik wrote in his notebook, the same one where he had scribbled notes the night before the incident. He wrote not for grades or for anyone else's approval, but to remember, to make sense of the chaos. His words flowed. They wanted me to be small. They wanted me to doubt. But the truth doesn't shrink. It grows. And once it's spoken, it belongs to everyone who hears it. Unbeknownst to him, others were also writing posts on social media, anonymous messages, threads that spread faster than wildfire. Within days, the story leapt from whispers in a school hallway to headlines on community pages. Student stands up to racist comment in classroom. The world was watching now, and Mr. Hayes could no longer pretend it hadn't happened. By the third day after the incident, the school was no longer a shul, it was a stage. Cameras hadn't arrived yet, but the attention, the whispers, the heat of scrutiny were everywhere. Malik walked down the hallway, backpack heavy on his shoulders, feeling the current of eyes trailing him. He was no longer invisible. In fact, he was too visible. Some kids gave him nods of respect. Others stared with the kind of cold detachment that warned, "You've stirred trouble, and trouble makes us uncomfortable." The administration, of course, scrambled. The principal called Malik's mother, words coated in the honey of professionalism, but carrying the bitterness of damage control. "We're investigating the matter thoroughly," she had said. Malik's mother listened quietly, her silence sharper than any retort. When she hung up, she turned to Malik. "They are protecting their walls, not the truth. You must decide if you want to break those walls down." Malik nodded, but the weight pressed heavier. Being a symbol was a burden. In class, Mr. Hayes was a shadow of himself. His once sharp voice, the one that had cut students into silence, now wavered like brittle glass. He clung to the chalkboard, over-explaining, avoiding confrontation, pretending nothing had happened. But the students did not let him forget. Every silence in the room was now laced with accusation. Every stumble in his words seemed louder. He was unraveling in real time, and the classroom bore witness. It was during a literature discussion that the next spark ignited. The book was about justice, resilience, the fight against systems designed to crush. Irony practically screamed from the pages. Malik raised his hand not out of defiance, but out of genuine desire to share what he saw. Mr. Hayes hesitated, his throat tightening, then reluctantly nodded. Malik spoke clearly, weaving the book's themes with his own reflections. The story isn't just about one person being mistreated. It's about how silence lets injustice survive. If you see it and say nothing, you're part of it. His words hung in the air like heavy smoke. A hush followed. Then a student from the back added, "Yeah, like what happened here." Murmurs spread. "Mr. Hayes snapped. This class is about literature, not politics." But his voice cracked, his anger brittle. The students saw through it. They weren't children anymore. They were witnesses to a man drowning in his own refusal to face the truth. At lunch, Malik found himself surrounded by a group of students he never usually sat with. Sarah, Jason, and two others slid their trays across to his table. Jason, whose sarcasm often shielded his own insecurities, leaned forward. "Look, man, I said some dumb stuff before. Laughed when I shouldn't have. But yesterday what you said, it was real. People are listening now." Malik studied him, seeing not just guilt, but possibility. Maybe change began like this, not in giant leaps, but in the quiet courage of admission. Meanwhile, whispers of the incident leaked beyond the school. Parents began asking questions. Some defended Hayes, claiming he was being misunderstood or too harshly judged. Others demanded accountability, furious that a child had been humiliated because of his race. Social media posts multiplied, screenshots of quotes attributed to Malik spreading far beyond the walls of the classroom. His name became more than a student's name became a headline. For Mr. Hayes, the walls were closing in. At home, he sat in the dim glow of his living room, scrolling through threads that painted him as a villain. His chest tightened with each word. Racist, unfit to teach, disgrace. He slammed the laptop shut, but the voices stayed. His wife, sitting across from him, finally asked, "Did you say it?" He opened his mouth, then shut it. Admitting would mean collapse. Denying would mean lying not just to her, but to himself. He turned away, unable to answer. The next day, the principal announced an open forum meeting where students and parents could speak. "We believe in dialogue," she said. But the truth was clear. They were trying to contain a fire already too wild. Malik's mother insisted he attend. "Not because you owe them anything," she explained, "but because your voice is stronger than their excuses." That evening, the auditorium swelled with tension. Parents filled the seats, teachers stood awkwardly at the sides, and students whispered excitedly in clusters. Mr. Hayes sat near the front, his tie knotted too tightly, sweat glistening at his temples. He looked less like the commanding teacher he once had been and more like a man awaiting trial. One by one, people spoke. Some parents expressed outrage, their voices shaking with anger. Others defended Hayes, citing his years of service, his strict but fair methods. The room divided itself into invisible lines, those who clung to the comfort of the past, and those who demanded a different future. When Malik's name was called, the room quieted. He walked to the podium, every step echoing. The golden lights of the auditorium seemed to spotlight him, painting his face in warmth. He took a breath, steadying himself. Then he spoke not as a boy seeking approval, but as someone who carried a truth too heavy to ignore. "I didn't ask to be here," he began. "I didn't ask to be singled out, mocked, or made to feel like I didn't belong. But it happened, and it happens more than anyone here wants to admit. You think it's just one comment, just one laugh, just one moment. But those moments stack up. They weigh us down. They tell us we are less. Until we believe it." His voice cracked, but only for a moment. "I will not believe it. I know who I am. I know my worth. And I will not let anyone take it away, not even the people who are supposed to teach me." The silence that followed was thunderous. Parents shifted in their seats, teachers stared at the floor, students leaned forward with wide eyes. Malik's words had pierced deeper than any accusation could. They were not about blame. They were about truth. Mr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He wanted to speak, to defend, to explain, but the words would not come. Instead, he felt the collapse begin, not physical, not yet, but inside. A structure he had built for years, a structure of superiority and denial, was crumbling. The principal cleared her throat, thanking Malik, moving the forum along. But the atmosphere had changed. Something irreversible had occurred. Malik returned to his seat, his mother's hand squeezing his firmly. He felt lighter, not because the fight was over, but because he had finally spoken without restraint. That night, as he lay in bed, Malik thought of his grandmother's words. Your silence can be a shield, but your words, when chosen, can be fire. He had chosen, and the fire was spreading. He only hoped it would burn away the lies and not consume him in the process. For Mr. Hayes, sleep did not come. His mind replayed the scene, Malik's voice ringing in his ears. He saw the eyes of his students, not fearful but judging, weighing him, finding him lacking. He reached for a bottle of whiskey, poured too much into a glass, and drank until the room blurred. But the blur did not erase the truth. It only magnified the hollow space inside him where certainty used to live. The storm was not over. In fact, it was only beginning. The morning after the forum, the school hallways felt like a battlefield after the first cannon fire, silent, smoky, waiting for the next explosion. Posters for sports events hung limp on the walls. Laughter in the cafeteria seemed forced, and every conversation inevitably returned to one subject: the teacher, the student, the truth. Malik walked through it all like a ghost who had suddenly become visible. Heads turned when he passed. Some kids whispered encouragement, "You killed it last night. We're with you," while others gave him looks that mixed resentment with fear. To them, he had not just stood up to Hayes. He had disrupted the fragile balance they clung to. In class, Mr. Hayes looked hollow. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and his once commanding voice barely held together. He opened the lesson with trembling hands, chalk scratching awkwardly across the board. His words about literary themes fell flat, meaningless against the unspoken storm in the room. Then came the breaking moment. Jason, the loudmouth who had once mocked Malik but had since shifted sides, raised his hand. "Mr. Hayes," he said, voice steady, "don't you think this book is about facing your own prejudice? About people realizing the harm they've done?" The question was sharp, intentional. The class leaned in. Hayes froze. His throat tightened. He tried to respond, but the words caught. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally, he muttered, "That's not relevant to this discussion." But everyone knew it was. His deflection was another confession. Malik watched carefully, not gloating, not smiling. He felt no victory in watching a man crumble. He only felt the weight of truth pressing heavier. This wasn't about destroying Hayes, it was about exposing the sickness that had long hidden beneath authority. By the afternoon, rumors swirled that the school board would intervene. Parents had flooded the district office with emails, some defending Hayes, some demanding his resignation. The administration could no longer pretend neutrality. A hearing was scheduled, one that would decide whether Hayes would continue teaching. The night before the hearing, Malik sat with his notebook open, pen trembling in his hand. He wasn't sure what to write. He wasn't sure if words could capture the weight of the week, the humiliation, the fire, the forum, the shifting tides. But he began anyway. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about light. If the truth can shine, maybe even the ones who hurt us can see. Maybe even they can change. Meanwhile, Hayes sat in his dim kitchen, surrounded by unpaid bills and the silence of a wife who no longer spoke to him. He stared at the bottle on the counter, then at the mirror across the room. For the first time, he saw himself not as the strict, authoritative teacher he had always imagined, but as a man hiding behind fear. He whispered into the empty room, "What have I done?" The words felt like both confession and collapse. The hearing arrived. The boardroom was packed: parents, students, teachers, reporters. The air buzzed with tension, thick enough to choke on. Hayes sat at one table, his lawyer whispering in his ear. Malik sat at another, his mother's hand resting firmly on his shoulder. The proceedings began with official language, sterile and cold. But it did not stay that way for long. Witnesses were called. Students testified. voices trembling but honest. They described the way Hayes mocked, belittled, and singled out. One by one, their stories painted a picture too detailed to ignore. Malik spoke last. His words were calm, steady. I don't hate him. I don't want revenge. But no student should walk into a classroom afraid that the person who's supposed to teach them will humiliate them instead. That's not education. That's destruction. All eyes turned to Hayes. It was his chance to defend himself, to cling to denial, to twist the narrative. He stood, hands shaking. For a moment, silence pressed against him like a weight. Then his voice cracked. I thought I was upholding standards, he said, eyes darting around the room. I thought I was, pushing students to be better. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of change. Afraid of anyone who didn't look like me, talk like me, think like me. I let that fear become cruelty. And I hurt the very kids I was meant to help. His voice broke, tears welling. Especially Malik. I humiliated you. I can't take that back. But I see it now. And I don't know how to carry it. The room held its breath. For once, the arrogance was gone. In its place stood a man broken open by truth. The board deliberated briefly. Their decision was firm. Hayes would be removed from his position. The announcement sent ripples through the room. Some sighed in relief. Others gasped in anger. But for Malik, it was neither triumph nor tragedy. It was simply necessary. Afterward, Malik stepped outside, the golden sunlight washing over him. Students gathered around, some patting his back, some just standing nearby, as if his presence itself offered strength. His mother hugged him tightly. You carried yourself with dignity, she whispered. That is a victory no one can take. Across the parking lot, Hayes emerged, his figure slouched, his tie loosened. He looked smaller than Malik had ever seen him. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Hayes mouthed two words, I'm sorry. Malik gave a slight nod. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He simply acknowledged it. Because forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about letting someone off the hook. It was about refusing to let their cruelty define you. Weeks later, the school began to change. Teachers attended workshops on bias, students formed groups to discuss equality, and Malik's name became synonymous not with victimhood, but with courage. He still faced challenges, still walked hallways where not everyone welcomed him. But he walked taller, knowing his voice had mattered. In his notebook, he wrote the final words of the chapter that had begun with humiliation. The truth is sunlight. It hurts the eyes at first, but it makes everything grow. Even the people who once lived in shadows. The golden light poured through his window as he closed the book. He felt the warmth on his skin and understood that while one battle was over, the larger fight would continue. But he was ready. And this time, he would not walk alone. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.